first today. First time I've seen people in 16 months face to face. Hasn't been a lot of that. I am going to ask you to help out today and participate and answer questions that you feel comfortable answering, because part of this discussion, I think, is one that looks at the social aspects of what inclusion is. And I think there's two different kinds of imperatives, I think, when we talk about inclusion. One is the legal aspect of it, and that it's illegal to exclude certain folks from our classroom, from our society, and also the social and emotional part of it, which, as we've experienced in the last year, certainly has a lot of layers to what inclusion truly means. So I think, let me ask you a question. When you think of inclusion, what do you think? What's your definition?
Diversity.
Diversity. So you think of, in fact, that's, it's really kind of interesting. Over the last year, we've kind of changed inclusion to diversity, my mind just blank, E and inclusion, equity and inclusion. Yeah. And so we're kind of making sure that we're putting all the layers on when we look at inclusion. What else do we think about, like in the classroom or anywhere? Yeah.
I think all are welcome and differentiating to set all students up for success.
Good. And I hope today to put pins in that balloon. But yes, I agree with you. I think that's the goal. One of the things that I'll speak about today, because I am a lifelong special educator, is when we talk about, and most of you are familiar with IEPs, individual education programs, and or plans, and we talk about the difference between goals and expectations. And every year we set up an annual goal, right? And then we talk about objectives to meet those goals. And I think a lot of us confuse goals with expectations. We have goals. This is what I love about special ed. And if we don't reach those goals, we don't kill ourselves. We look at what did we do wrong? What happened that prevented us from reaching those goals? And what kinds of things can we do to meet those goals next time? So we do very little self-blaming on this. That's in a very positive approach if you think about it. We're not saying, well, I didn't do that. No, that's different than expectations. We never say, we expect to meet those goals. We expect you to be able to do this and this and that. We might expect it, as my stepson would say, with air quotes, but not the true expectation, meaning there's no real hard consequence to it. So there's really a couple of different aspects to this that we need to take care of. I think it's important, and I never thought I would say this in a classroom, to look at the history of this a little, because that's nothing more relevant than what's going on right now for certain. But I think it's really important, and at least somewhat interesting, to take a look at how we got to where we are today, because there has been a sea change, and there has been a dramatic sea change in where we are today. Back when I was a puppy, in the 60s, that's when special ed started becoming a discipline in a major way. Before that, it was pretty informal. We took kids and we kind of excluded them, frankly. We put them in institutions, or we put them in, if they're very, very severe, we put them in special education classes outside of the school sometimes, and sometimes candidly in the basement. We put them as far away from everybody else as we possibly could. And there was a movement that occurred called mainstreaming. Some of you might be familiar with mainstreaming. Basically, the idea of mainstreaming was that these kids with disabilities belonged in a general ed classroom, that you couldn't take them out, fix them, whatever that meant, and put them in the general ed classroom and expect that general ed classroom to be prepared for that student. Or expect that person who's a special ed person, the kid himself, can succeed in that environment. Because whatever practice they're getting, whatever instruction they're getting in an excluded setting. And the demands are significantly different. The example that I used to give was that in those days, if you walked into a special ed classroom, there was, say, 8 or 10 kids in the special ed self-contained setting outside of the general classroom. So if a kid raises his hand, we're going to go right to him. That interaction is different in a general ed classroom. If you've got 25 students in that classroom, or 30, student raises his hand, you're not going to go right to him, because you might be helping someone else, or there might be 5 students in front of them. So we need to be able to, and this is as relevant today, by the way, as it was then, we need to be able to teach that student how to deal with the general setting. And consequently, we need to teach the general ed setting how to deal with the kid. And that's, what we kind of mean about shared responsibility. So it was a developing discipline. The discipline is still relatively young, special education. We thought we could take a look at a child and come up with ways, frankly, to quote unquote cure them. We said, okay, here's a bunch of kids that have learning disabilities, inability to read. So let's look at these young children and let's take a look at what kind of characteristics they have. So a lot of the kids were clumsy, frankly. They couldn't catch the ball the way other kids could catch a ball. They couldn't walk balance beams the way they walked. There were developmental milestones that they may have missed, like crawling or walking before they would crawl. And a lot of data were collected about the characteristics of kids with learning disabilities. And a lot of really smart people looked at those data. These were not charlatans. These were, researchers, special education researchers who were just getting their toes in the water about special education and said, okay, so we have all these clumsy kids and they can't read because it might be something neurological going on. Let's make them less clumsy. Let's help them walk balance beams. Let's help them to become more coordinated. Let's see if they could go like this. That might be the first time in my life I've ever done that. Successfully. So let's throw balls. So in the early days, we were doing all of these kinds of exercises, these sensory exercises. Gross motor skills we were looking at, fine motor skills, because these young children seem to have these similar characteristics. So whole programs were created, and special ed were, a lot of kids were crawling and walking balance beams and doing snow angels outside, and all sorts of things to become better coordinated. And what happened was they became better coordinated, but they still couldn't read a lick because that has nothing to do with reading. How do we know that? Well, kids with cerebral palsy can read beautifully. So if that was a prerequisite to being a good reader, then they would never be able to read. Generalizing, as an example. But you got to understand, in those days we were looking for a way to teach, and it couldn't be that simple. And some researchers at that time said, if you teach these children how to read in a real distinct way, they'll learn how to read. And what's happening is that we haven't really dissected what reading is for a lot of kids. Many kids that we have in our classrooms come to class already reading in kindergarten, first and second grade. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. So the preparation differs. So if you're teaching first grade or second grade and you're doing sounds, and you're going to go, here's the B, and we're pretending there's a B there, and you're going to go, buh, and everyone goes, buh, goes, cuh, and everyone does that, and you have a class of 30. And what about those 3 kids who aren't doing that, who aren't able to recite, who don't see that letter as a form that means B? Well, frankly, most of us kept going as teachers because I'm not going to hold the whole class up for 3 kids. I got 27 that are moving. And they're not doing, these teachers aren't doing this in a mean way. They're trying to be somewhat efficient. So those 3 kids who didn't come to class, didn't come to school prepared, maybe one of them has a neurological problem that prevents them from seeing these shapes and being able to attach those shapes to a sound. The other 2 just didn't get it when they were growing up, when they weren't being read to. They didn't have a sister or brother who was 3 years older who made them play school downstairs in the basement, strapped to the chair. Read. they were just kids. And they fell farther behind. So the next year they didn't have those skills. The next year they didn't have those. So they kind of got clumped in with those other special ed kids. So the amount of preparation that we had, the amount of instruction that we had, growing up, K to 0 to 5, prepared us, A, for succeeding in school, but also, consequently, had some kids falling behind. So we needed to figure out a way to task analyze all of this information. And we needed to say, hey, look at, those kids might need a different kind of instruction as well. They might need a different kind of instruction as well. And that was a challenge. And by the time our discipline got its act together in that way and started saying, okay, let's look at ways to teach reading skills, for example. We can use a concept called direct instruction. And direct instruction is a way that I'm fairly confident I could teach you particular skills, sounds and phonics and all of that. I can't teach you to think deeply on it, but I'm going to teach you the access to the instruction, to the reading. I'm going to get you access to that. We're getting there. Say, okay, now let's get these kids and we'll do some direct instruction with them. However, at the same time, this social movement was occurring. And the social movement was saying, special ed is bad. Special ed is bad. We put a kid in a special ed room, we're excluding them. We're labeling them. Other kids are treating them differently. They are seeing themselves differently. Bad. We need to get these kids back into the classroom where they belong with other children. And that's how they will learn. We call that inclusion. And then there seem to be categories of inclusion, which I always, full inclusion was used. And it was one of my favorite books called by a guy named Jim Coffin, The Illusion of Full Inclusion. Okay? And the idea was, you can't just include, you got to include everybody. Just kill special ed. They said, no, we're not going to kill, we'll put special ed teachers in the general ed classroom and we'll try to figure out a way to do services that way. And there were very significant camps that collided about that. And depending on what town you lived in, maybe even what school within that town, will dictate the philosophy of how you're treating kids with disabilities in that school. It's the way we do things in America. Forget the research, let's just do what I feel, And then, I'm probably going to get in some trouble with this. Maybe Sister Mary Paul will let me. The idea basically is also these schools that are run by communities, run by boards of education, many of those folks didn't know the science. They just had deep-seated beliefs about how their children should be taught. Sometimes it's, I was in those classrooms, I know how it felt. And emotion's a great thing, passion's a great thing, but without science, it could be a destructive thing, frankly, to kids. Because what happened, in more cases than not, is that kids with disabilities weren't getting their needs met. So, if they're well-behaved, they sat there. But they weren't learning as much as they could have been learning because we finally were figuring out how to teach those guys. And we finally figured it out and they took them away. I used to tell my class, I said, what's the problem with what we used to talk about labeling, and said, this whole thing is about self-concept. And I used to say to them, you want really good self-concept then? I understand now. How do we define self-concept? This class would tell me how they would define self-concept. I said, well, from what I'm hearing you say is that what the outside world thinks of you is helps you understand who you are and what you're about, helps form yourself. I said, great. Next week, we're meeting at the med school. We're going to be in medicine 128, a class. You'll be having class with doctors. That's how smart you're going to be. You can call your parents and say, you know, I was in intro to special education last week. Now I'm going to med school. How good am I? Your son is finally a doctor. He's going to be a doctor. Okay. So then when you go to that school, that med school class, and you're going to sit in that class with everyone else, these people who have had medicine 1, medicine 2, medicine 3. I forgot what I said this medicine class was, but all the way up to that class, no, you haven't, right? Because you were just in intro to special ed last week. So they'll turn around and they'll say, okay, Kate, how do we dissect a nose? And she goes, oh, okay, Frank, how do we dissect it? He tells us, and I go, great job, Frank. And Kate probably is feeling great about herself right there because she's still in that med school class. I'm still an intern. Okay? And I'll keep asking questions, and Kate will keep failing those questions, but she's in that class, right? Inclusion. Because it's I'm going to, and I'm in a general ed setting. I'm with a bunch of 5th graders. Except one little problem. I can't do the work. And just sitting here doesn't make me feel better about myself because I'm not stupid. I might have a disability, but I'm not stupid. I know I can't do this work. I know that if you don't call on me, it's because you know I don't know the answer. I'm not stupid. So who are we kidding if you're not going to meet my needs? And by the way, if I'm not well behaved, best thing about kids, they'll tell you right away, one way or the other, if you're not meeting their needs. Because they'll start talking to the kid next to them, or throwing things at the girl in front of them, or whatever. Because I'm bored. I'm sitting here and I'm dying. So socially, everyone feels real good. I'm in a Catholic school that doesn't have special ed. ACEs. I no longer have a disability. I'm in a charter school that doesn't have special ed. Great. I no longer have a disability. My kid no longer has a disability. He's going to the charter school of no disabilities. Private school. Are we pretending that these kids don't have brains because they have a disability? Are we pretending that they don't see the world around them because they have a disability? Why don't you ask them? Why don't you ask them if they get it, what's going on? So we try different things to keep them in the setting. And by the way, none of this is vicious, because the whole social part of this is very, very inviting. You know, I have friends who, when their children, one of my best friends, his child, I'm fairly safe, he's not going to see this. His child had a speech and language problem, a real distinct speech problem. Couldn't understand much of what the person said. Speech and language is a disability in our country. You get services for free. The school provides them. You have to have special ed services. This brilliant man went crazy because his kid was now special ed. There wasn't, because he defined special ed as, in those days, the word was retardation, a kid having mental retardation, or a kid having learning disability, or a kid being, emotionally disturbed. That's his definition. He remembers special ed when he went to school. Brilliant scholar. He said, no, Paul. He's not special ed. I said, well, I get services. such a hard issue. It's such a difficult issue. And I have such empathy for the teachers and the parents who have to navigate that issue, but the kid's in the middle of it. You know, the kid is truly in the middle. And there's some real marvelous things that we can do in classrooms for kids with disabilities in general settings, in non-special, that benefit not only that kid, but benefit the lower third of the class. Defining lower third as kids who aren't achieving on that particular task. My father used to say that I was in the upper lower third of my class. Or he would say that because of me, I made the top half of the class possible. So, which is what drew me to these kids. Truly, it's what drew me to these kids. So, there's so many different things. You know what I love about not having taught in so long? I probably prepared, we could be here till 3 tomorrow in the afternoon because I have so much stuff to do. I'm never going to get past this. So when I started thinking of these things, and when I started training teachers and counselors, the question that came to my mind was, how do we give these kids a fair shake? We had 2 questions. How does the outside give these kids a fair shake in our classrooms? And what can I do? As I like to tell my faculty and staff, it's all about me. So what can I do? How can I make a difference in a kid's life? So I started thinking about how we treat kids with disabilities. And I started surveying my intro class. So I had a class of about 180 students, especially in Central Michigan. And I listed, we're pretending I'm listing them here, 10 quote unquote conditions. And in those days, again, it was mental retardation, emotional disturbance, learning disabilities, visual impairment, hearing impairment. Then I threw some others in: obesity, cerebral palsy, autism. And I said to the students, 10 conditions. And I had little spaces next to them, and I said, 1 to 10. If you had to have them, what's the thing that you would be most comfortable having, relatively speaking, and least comfortable having? So to me, I had to say, okay, this is allowing me to know a lot of things. One is the capacity that many of my students might have with regard to acceptance of people with other disabilities. If I wouldn't want to have a kid in my classroom who's blind, if that makes me uncomfortable, it tells me I got a lot of work to do about teaching about acceptance of blind. Okay? Every semester I did this class, among the top 5 was obesity. People would rather have mental retardation than be obese. People would rather be blind than be obese. So inclusion's not just disability. I'm sure if we did it now, we would throw race in there as well. Could you imagine if we did it now and students said, I'd rather be this than this race? Oh, my heart. I wouldn't be surprised because of the systemic racism. That's what system means. It's how we were brought up. That's what it is. Whether it's visual, visceral. Peace. What do I do with that? Yell at you? You kidding me? What was also in the top 5 was physical disability. It makes me uncomfortable to see a kid in my classroom with significant physical disabilities. As a teacher, learning is there. It's physical. Your job's done. You don't have to worry about curing the kid, right? You have to worry about teaching the kid. So we started, I said, wow, a lot of work ahead of us. And just for the heck of it, because my brain, as you probably figured out by now, goes like a lot of different ways. I said, how many of you hate math? And then like a third of them raised their hand. I said, great. I can't wait to be in your class next year when you teach math. Because nothing thrills me more than having a teacher who hates the subject matter for the class that I'm in. Because they were elementary ed teachers. They taught math. I'm jazzed. Can't wait. And they all laugh. What do we do about it? Learn math. Because you wouldn't hate it. You wouldn't be at the end of the day saying, okay, now we got to do math. And I used to tell them, I said, I'm asked frequently about how do I motivate teachers. Just pretend that what you're doing right now is the thing that you would most want to do, no matter what. And if you can't pretend, don't teach. Because some of it's pretending. Pretend that you are really excited about math today. And you hate it, I know, but it's not about you. Shared responsibility. Shared responsibility. What am I doing that's having an effect on these kids? So when we look at these kids, we start thinking as a classroom teacher, counselor, what am I going to do this year with Joe Basilovich? Joe's in my classroom. What am I going to do? So I'm going to give you some examples, okay? Joe Basilovich is in 5th grade, and he reads on the 2nd grade level. So we're going to set up an annual goal for him. Anyone got one for me? What kind of an annual goal we have? He reads on the 2nd grade level, and by the way, this is a softball, and I'm making, and so that it's as easy as it sounds.
Reads at a 3rd grade level?
Read at the 3rd grade level. Of course, now, Snarky Paul says, which will now scare everyone else from participating, right? Snarky Paul says, so wait a second. He's in 5th grade, he's on the 2nd grade level, and yet your goal for next year is that he'll do 1 year when he's never been able to do 1 year in 1 year before. Okay, but it's a goal. So if he doesn't reach it, well, not going to be hypocritical. I already said that if we don't reach our goals. But that's a goal. That's like saying to the person who wants to lose weight and he weighs 220 in July, that by school starts, he'll weigh 150. That's a goal, That's why they have goals, right? What other disabilities do we have we want to talk about? How about learning disability? Well, that might be fit under reading. Math. Joe Basilovich is in 5th grade again, and he can add and subtract. What might be a nice goal for him for next year? Multiplication. Well, yes. No. Sure. Good. Nice. Joe Basilovich misbehaves. He gets very angry. He has tantrums. That's great. He throws things at people. He cries daily, multiple times. Talks back. What's an annual goal for him? By the end of the year, Joe will
take a body break when he feels he's being overwhelmed.
Huh? He'll when he feels bad, he'll walk out. Anything else?
Verbalize what he's upset about.
Because I'm being recorded on this, I can't tell you what verbalizations he.
Yeah.
You defiler of mothers, maybe. And by the way, I've always liked when we talk about shared responsibility and kids say that, and the teacher, I don't care what he says, but he can't say that. Really? You got a list now what you're going to do? Give him the list of bad words he could say because you don't like one of them. There was a talk I did many, many years ago, so president of Division of Disabilities, of emotional disabilities. And the topic was, which I stole off a friend of mine, who's crazy? Them or us? I'm going to expect you now not to. And that's the interesting thing about, because I set you up and I was snarky, if I was nice and accepting and I said, good job, that's exactly what we do. And I use good job, that's exactly what we do, right? That's how we encourage participation by not being a goofy teacher. You would say, by the end of the year, Joe Basilovich will not throw things at his classmates, will not tantrum. Maybe we'll say we'll tantrum half as much. Maybe we'll be even. Will not, and we'll have these goals. So if it's 41 things, we'll get it down to 10. And then we'll say, what's the long-term goal? 0. I cannot tell you how many fabulous meetings I've been in with teachers, counselors, psychologists, school psychologists, where I've sat quietly, believe it or not, and listened to these goals. And they will say, long-term goal, he'll go in the general ed classroom and he'll have some triggers that he'll be able to walk out when he feels them coming. And I would say, so basically you're saying that we're going to cure him. So I have a question to ask you. When you have a kid in your classroom that has cognitive disabilities, IQ of 60, do you say by the end of the year he'll have an IQ of 100? He'll be normal? Blind kid, he'll be able to see by the end of the year? Hearing impaired kid will be able to hear? It's almost biblical if you think about it. We're now curing kids with disabilities. No, you only do that with a kid with behavior. Because the teacher in us believes that behavior is willful and not part of a kid's disability. We believe that he can control himself, especially if we give him candy or timeouts or whatever things that we do, well-meaning to control the behavior. Do they work? Some of them work great for a time. And then one day, guess what? His disability is still there because you didn't cure it. And he throws something. And then we overreact, throw the kid out. I thought you learned to be somebody who you're not. And by the way, we don't start accepting this until they become adults. Then we start revisiting mental illness again instead of behavior disorders. Now we relabel, label's good. Now I've got a disability. I've got mental illness. My brother has mental illness. My brother has depression. You know any 6th graders with depression? Well, we hear that more in the north suburbs, not so much in the south side. It's got to do with culture too. It's got to do with disability. It's got to do with shared responsibility. What are our reasonable expectations? What are our reasonable goals for these kids? And this is where it's so trying for teachers. It is so difficult for teachers because I can talk this stuff, but I'm not sitting in front of the classroom with that kid in the room. I remember I was working with a kid. His name was Sean, brilliant kid. And the teacher had a hard time with him. And she was really willing, I'll do anything to help the kid. So she, we talk about it, and I come in and do some observations. The kid was great, but he had emotional problems. So she's doing this exercises like 5th grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, and they're doing these exercises, and they're all in rows, and they're doing math problems, some long division math problems. It's sad that I remember all of this, but I can't remember my kids' names. Okay, so they have all of these kinds of problems, and they're running up and back, and the kids are messing up. They're not. They're all wrong. I mean, they're not getting it right, and it's a mess. And so the teacher immediately hones in on that and says, hold on. Let me give you a hint on how to do this. And she goes up and changes the algorithm a little and changes. She said, if you do this, look at these as Sean. Oh, that was very helpful. Can you think of another way to do that? He says, do it. And he says, because that's the way you taught us. We're not deaf. We heard that early. You know, how many of us have been in a classroom where we say to the teacher, I don't understand the Pythagorean theorem. And the teacher then explains it the exact same way he or she did the first time. And just once, I want that kid to say, not deaf, heard that the first time, don't understand it this way. Can you tell me another way to understand it? That's the challenge of teaching. Don't need a hearing test. So when teachers say to the classroom, by the way, especially these kids, can you tell me what your homework assignment is? Yeah, I can tell you, but I don't know if I know how to do it. That's the question you should be asking me. Because I can tell you one thing, my parents don't know how to do it. I can tell you that, my parents don't. I'm a fairly educated man. I taught school for 8 years, public school, taught kids with disabilities, taught math. And my 4th grade daughter looks up at me and says, this isn't the way Mrs. Johnson taught it. Well, thank you, dear. Yeah, I know how to, no, it's gotta be this. We know the challenge. So she goes on. Lesson changes, and they're doing science. And she says, can someone tell me what's photosynthesis? Kid stands up. No one raises their hand. Sean raises his hand. Stands up. Sean does an 8-minute thesis on photosynthesis. I finally understand photosynthesis when we're done. Okay? I get it now. Didn't get it my whole life. Got it now. She's beaming. Sean, that's fabulous. Wow. Good job. He looks at her and goes, really? I just guessed. Get out of here. Can't you do anything? Can't you just take praise? Why do you have to be this way? Kid walks out proudly. He walks out because he's getting attention. And that's what he wanted. And he walks out the door, goes to the principal's office. I met the principal later. And he said, I said to Sean, why are you here? He said, photosynthesis. Those of us who deal with kids with behavior, we look at behavior as an absolute value for those of you that know math. Absolute value, remember, negative numbers are positive numbers. It's just the integers from 0. I hope that's right. So it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. It's reinforcing to a kid with behavior problems. If you don't give me positive behavior, I'll get the negative. That works for me too. Not all kids, but some kids. You know, the dweebs, the good kids, probably you, you're here on a Friday afternoon, that's not good. I got to get the good. You know, I'm the one that stays up all night worrying about a test. My kids sleep. They sleep well the night before a test. Because if they fail, they know it's not their essence. You think it's your essence. Especially if the teacher's gonna yell at me or give me, oh, I knew you wouldn't pass. Didn't you study, Frank? No. Let's see if I can dig you some more. This inclusion? This is helping this kid? It's a shared responsibility. Because the stuff we're talking about now is not just in our classroom. And we're the models. We're the people in the classroom that affects. You know, I had a teacher once say, I'll never forget this. She said to the kid, come on now, you could do this. Do it for me. And I said to myself, you think he's doing it to get into Harvard? He's doing it for you. We should have said that. So what's our task then? Whether it's behavior or it's academics, I'm going to go way historical on you. It's our task, instead of looking at inclusion, instead of looking at mainstreaming, the first law, Public Law 94-142, said that we need to put kids in the least restrictive environment. And everyone said, well, what the hell does that mean? Because it's certainly not just the classroom. We know that by now, right? Because the classroom is not going to define anything. Mainstream or regular classroom or general classroom. We don't call them regular, we call them general because regular suggests the regular kids and we don't want to say regular kids. Woke was back then as well, by the way. General. It's very important. Fine. What do they do? How we treat those kids? What we do is we take a look at the environment that we're in and say, how can we create an environment where that individual is not going to get handicapped by their disability? A problem that we have in special ed sometimes is that we say our task as special educators is for individuals, for our students, to reach their potential. Well, if you ever heard a goal, that's a goal. That's a goal of all teachers. But it's not our task. Okay. Our task is to take a look at a kid, if we're looking at kids with disabilities, and say, what can that kid do because of his disability? I can't see because I'm blind. What do I do to help that kid learn in my classroom because he's visually impaired? Hearing impaired. What can I do? And thanks to science, there's a whole lot of stuff we can do right now for kids who are visually impaired, for kids who are hearing impaired, for kids with physical disabilities. We've opened up the doors for many, many of those kids, depending on the economics of that particular school or school district. So how do I prevent that kid from being handicapped because of the disability? And if you think about all the kids that we have in our classes, what kinds of things can I do that will not only help that kid, but will help other kids? Because we all have different ways that we like to learn. And I'm willing to bet you that whatever modification you make for that kid, other kids in your classroom are going to benefit from it. Even groups of kids will benefit from it, will do better because of that. So we could even handle that to some degrees with regard to learning. We could create different ways to teach kids, to get information in. One of the things that we know and knew with kids with special needs, kids with learning disability, is that they couldn't read well. That was usually the key. Kids with learning disabilities, they couldn't read very well. And as they got older, they fell farther and farther behind. We also knew by the way, that many of those kids were quite bright intellectually. In fact, the definition of learning disabilities is normal intelligence, but they don't have the skills to do the work at their level. So our job was to what? Two things. And this is the key in my mind. What's our goal? To teach them how to read? Well, if they have a true cognitive disability, you're going to be up against the wall, aren't you, on some of that, because they can't do it because of their disability. If it's a function of teaching, frankly, meaning we haven't figured out a way to teach that kid yet, and there's a lot of different successful ways to teach kids yet. If that's the function, well, then we could help that kid that way and help others the same way, because they might learn better that way. But there's another question, especially as the kids get older. Is the function of education to teach those skills, to have them included? Or is it to teach them, very technical word now, stuff? Is it to teach them stuff? Do we need to have them know about history? Do we need to have them know about, stuff, school, stuff that school teaches? Math, social studies, civics. My heavens, that wouldn't be a bad thing in this decade, would it, to have kids understand civics? I won't get political, just saying. Stuff that, by the way, that was fun for most of us in school. The fun stuff was talking about stuff. It wasn't learning. I know my stepson, brilliant. For him, it was calculus. That was the fun stuff. But for a lot of us, it was talking about social studies. It was talking about these kinds of things. And hear me, with these kids, what we do, we give them reading materials that are years, that they can do, that they can read, that are years behind their current intellectual level. In the words of, and I'll clean it up a little, in the words that they will say to you is, this is baby crap. You're giving me baby crap. How do you expect me to be interested in baby crap? And you say, if you're nasty, you gotta walk before you could run. You gotta crawl before you could walk. You won't be able to access the exciting stuff until you can read. And by the way, Mr. Blind Person, read this. Mr. Person with Physical Disabilities, run. Oh, no, that's silly, isn't it? It's not as silly. It's just as silly as telling this kid that. So our task is to be able to teach kids stuff first, not the skills first. And my guess is that's how you all learn as well. My guess is when you gravitate towards reading, you're not reading the medical books from that class that we talked about earlier. You're reading stuff that interests you. So our task for these kids, and by the way, other kids in those classrooms as well, these older kids, is to teach them about the Declaration of Independence or the Boston Tea Party. First, you teach them by talking about it, by doing a diorama, by throwing tea bags off your lectern, by doing whatever the hell you want to do, pardon me, so that they get the concept. And once they get the concept, once they can tell you the concept, once they understand the concept, then you have them read it. Because now they're reading stuff they know. Just like when you're reading the stuff that you know. It's a lot easier to read it. But what we do in education is we say, okay, I'm going to give you the hardest stuff to understand in the world, and I'm going to have you understand it the one way you can't learn. We call that individualized education. So we do it on workbooks, and we don't have workbooks anymore. Well, some of us do. We do it on sheets, we do it on other kinds of things at their own individual pace. And they're doing baby work. They're doing stuff they don't get. And they're bored to tears. Well, bored, as they would say. So. Not sure this is, I know that the introduction I'm about to say this was about Catholics. This is not about Catholics, it's about kids in schools. I can't speak to the open arms. I know that some cultures in some schools, and some school systems are less inviting than others. And the intuition is that they shouldn't be. I know of a young boy who was in who was asked to be in he tried to get into Walden School, which is kind of an interesting school program. They said, yeah, as long as he behaves. But then he can't do it. Because he can't behave. What school will he be invited in because he's a person? A person who deserves an education. I had a kid, I may get in trouble for this, I'll have to figure out a way to filter it, who had Tourette's. Boy, I'll give you the first syllables. He would go, fuff, 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 fuff. And he would do that. Whenever he got frustrated, fuff, fuff, fuff. Drove the teacher crazy. And he would do twitching. I walked in the room. Nobody is paying attention to this kid. No one cares. They're sixth graders. She puts the kid in the back. So now, if anyone walks by him, they're shoving the kid and waiting for a reaction. He used to have his hands that he would put down, rest this way. They'd stand on his hands when they walk by him because they're nasty kids. So we met with the team, and they had a neurologist there. Said, we give meds. Meds might inhibit the language. Oh, okay. That'd be nice. That happens. It's the only thing that's going wrong in this classroom for this kid is this behavior. Okay. That everyone else is ignoring except for the teacher. He's now sitting in class, and because of the meds, he's going, Arr! Arr! I'd rather the kid going, because to me, that's disturbing. What are we doing? How is that behavior affecting other kids? Where can that kid be invited, accepted, and ignored when it's appropriate to ignore them? What's the effect of that kid's behavior on others? And if it is, what's the long-term toll of it? There are certain kind of disabilities that have social cachet, for lack of better words. Learning disabilities. So you may not know this, but there's a very high incidence of learning disabilities in the north side suburbs, which creates accommodations so that these very bright kids can have longer time to take the standardized tests so that they can get to college. Very few of those kids, by the way, have emotional disturbance. It's always a learning disability. It's got a cachet. So we identify, there are certain suburbs where there are more kids with learning disabilities than kids who have cognitive disabilities. It's not a social disease, as Officer Krupke said in West Side Story, way aging myself on this. There shouldn't be a difference in what community you live in and how you're being identify to get the help that you should need. But if you're not giving help, then you shouldn't identify anyone. Specify help. Autism. It's another one with a big, we have more and more kids being identified with autism every year. And my favorite expression in autism, and I've written a book for parents on autism with a dear friend of mine, is a spectrum disorder. We're all spectrum. You're on the normal spectrum. What the hell does that even mean? We're all spectrum. So if that's what it's going to take to accept us, the human condition, the spectrum of the human condition, where you fit on it, how do I teach you in that setting? I wish I could say I've seen significant growth in this over my career, but I haven't. And in fact, there are fewer and fewer kids being identified with having a disability when in fact that they have that disability. I don't want to identify kids as having a disability when they don't. So because of that, we're not giving them the services that they need. And not giving them a service that they need is a gross injustice. It might make your community feel better, it might make your family feel better, and frankly, to a degree, it might make the kid feel a little better in certain situations. But there's not one of us who has a loved one who we know has a illness, a disease, that we wouldn't want to know what it was and how to help that person, whether cure them or fix it or manage it, because it's lifelong. There isn't one of us that goes into that situation. And that's the task that we have in front of us. And we have to move from that task, from where we are right now, to work on that. And I think it's all of our responsibilities. I think it's a shared responsibility. I think it's a responsibility that most people are taking care of, but right now the burden of teaching has never been greater. I like the politicians who are saying, we lost a year over, last 14 months or 15 months of education. Yes, we have. Yes, we have. Now, figure out a way to teach the kids what needs to be taught for those that lost the 15 months. You got to figure out what's important, what we need to focus on. We wouldn't have these expectations on anyone else. If it was a physical disability, we wouldn't say to them, forget that year you were in a hospital bed. I want you to be 2 years ahead today. We have an unbelievable understanding of the world around us when it affects us. And the idiocy, I'm in trouble. The idiocy of thinking otherwise is political and it's social, but it's not diagnostically correct. And none of us would want to be measured that way. None of us. And yet that's what we're listening to by in most cases, very, very well-meaning people. Thank you for your attention and your time. I appreciate you coming out here on a Friday afternoon. I feel like I'm a comedian now. Tip the waiter on your way out. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.